in the quiet town of Fall River, Massachusetts, during the sweltering summer of 1892. The scent of blood was in the air, though no one could yet smell it. On 2nd Street stood a modest 2.5-story house, not grand by the standards of the town's elite, but sturdy, clean, and owned by one of the wealthiest men in the region. That man was Andrew Borden, a stern, frugal, and by many accounts, unloving man. Andrew had clawed his way up the financial ladder through real estate and savvy investment. He lived with his second wife, Abby Durfee Gray Borden, and his 2 daughters, Emma and Lizzie. Lizzie Borden was the younger of the 2, a woman in her early 30s who never married, never worked, and who, by all appearances, lived a relatively uneventful life within the constraints of a conservative Victorian household. Yet, under the surface, a slow, seething rage was building like pressure behind a dam waiting to burst. The Borden home was not a happy one. While Emma and Lizzie had once shared a closer bond with their father before his second marriage, the arrival of Abby had driven a wedge between them. They viewed her not as a loving stepmother, but as a usurper, an outsider who enjoyed the comforts of their father's wealth while giving little warmth in return. Lizzie, in particular, held a deep resentment toward Abby, one that fermented over years of perceived slights and favoritism. Money was a frequent source of tension. Despite Andrew Borden's considerable wealth, he was notoriously stingy. The house had no running water, no indoor plumbing, and no electricity, even though such conveniences were available and affordable for a man of his means. Lizzie and Emma were made to live with the constraints of a frugal father who refused to indulge them while watching him lavish gifts and property on his new wife's family. But resentment is not always loud. It builds quietly in the corridors of a mind pushed to its limits. In Lizzie, it simmered beneath a thin veneer of respectability. She was active in the local church, a Sunday school teacher, and a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. To outsiders, she was the picture of piety and domestic virtue. But to those inside the Borden house, she was something else entirely unpredictable. Withdrawn and known for sudden bursts of anger, the final spark came in the form of a will. Rumors had begun to swirl that Andrew intended to leave the bulk of his estate to Abby and her relatives, potentially leaving his daughters with little more than a fraction of their expected inheritance. To a woman who had lived her entire life under her father's rule, such a betrayal could have felt like the final cut. Then came the morning of August 4th, 1892. It began as any other mundane, hot and still. Bridget Sullivan, the Borden family maid, was tasked with her usual morning chores. Despite suffering from a severe hangover and the brutal heat, Andrew Borden left for his morning walk around the business district. Abby remained inside. Lizzie, claiming to be occupied with chores and sewing, moved through the house in silence. Then, at approximately 9:30 a.m., Abby Borden was struck down. According to the medical examiner, she was hit 19 times in the back and head with a hatchet. The attack was so savage that her skull was split open. She fell to the floor of the guest bedroom, face down, arms outstretched, her blood soaking into the floorboards. Whoever had killed her knew the layout of the house, knew the routines, and knew where she'd been. An hour later, Andrew Borden returned home. He knocked on the front door, but found it locked. After several failed attempts, Bridget finally let him in. Lizzie greeted her father, removed his boots, and offered him a place to rest on the sitting room sofa. Just minutes later, he too would be dead. Struck 11 times in the face with the same or similar weapon, his features were rendered almost unrecognizable. One eye was completely cleaved in two, his nose nearly obliterated. Blood spattered the wall behind him, staining the parlor in crimson. Arcs. Lizzie claimed she discovered her father's body shortly thereafter and screamed for Bridget. Panic ensued. A doctor was called. Neighbors gathered, and soon, so did the police. But something about Lizzie's behavior didn't quite fit. She seemed oddly calm, composed, and almost rehearsed. When asked her whereabouts during the murders, Lizzie said she'd been in the barn, searching for fishing sinkers. Investigators found the barn stiflingly hot and full of dust, undisturbed. The alibi seemed questionable. Suspicion began to circle. Like vultures, what struck investigators first was the timing. Abby had been killed at least an hour before Andrew, in a house with only 3 people, Lizzie, Bridget, and the victims. How could Lizzie not have heard anything? The blows to both victims were savage, the kind that left behind not just blood but noise, thuds, crashes, cries. And yet Lizzie heard nothing. No struggle, no footfalls, no moans of agony. Her clothes showed no signs of blood, but a few days. After the murders, Bridget witnessed Lizzie burning a blue dress in the stove. When questioned, Lizzie said it was stained with paint. The police took note, adding to the strangeness. Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid, powerful poison, from a local druggist just days before the murders. She claimed it was for cleaning a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused the sale and later testified. In court, it added another layer to the growing suspicion. The murder weapon was never found definitively, though a hatchet with a broken handle was recovered from the basement. It was stained, though the exact nature of the stains was disputed. In 1892, forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprints were not yet standard. Blood typing was non-existent. The police relied instead on observation, witness statements, and motive. And motive, Lizzie had plenty. She stood to inherit a significant fortune if both her father and stepmother were out of the way. Her disdain for Abby was well documented, and her relationship with her father strained. On August 11th, Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The news stunned Fall River. How could this refined, church-going woman have committed such a barbaric crime? The trial began in June of 1893. It was the sensation of the year. Newspapers across the country published daily updates. Crowds gathered. Outside the courthouse, reporters chronicled every facial expression, every tremble of Lizzie's hands. She was defended by some of the best attorneys in Massachusetts, including former Governor George D. Robinson. The defense painted Lizzie as a virtuous woman, incapable of violence. They pointed to the lack of direct evidence, no eyewitness, no definitive murder weapon, no bloody clothes. The prosecution, on the other hand, emphasized motive and opportunity. They argued that only someone familiar with the household could have moved so silently and struck with such precision. They referenced the dress burning, the attempt to buy poison, and the inconsistencies in Lizzie's statements. But in the end, the jury deliberated for only 90 minutes. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. As the verdict was read, she collapsed into her seat, tears streaming down her face. But the court of public opinion was not so forgiving. Though legally exonerated, Lizzie was socially condemned. Her neighbors shunned her. Children sang taunting rhymes. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Though inaccurate in detail, the rhyme embedded itself into American folklore. It painted Lizzie not just as a suspect, but as a cultural icon of horror. She and Emma moved to a new home in Fall River, a large house they called Macabre. They hired staff, attended the theater, and attempted to carry on with life. But the stain of suspicion never lifted. Emma eventually broke ties with Lizzie in 1905 and moved away. The reasons were never publicly stated. Lizzie lived out the rest of her life in solitude, her once quiet demeanor now tinged with bitterness. She died in 1927 at the age of 66. Alone and estranged from the town she once called home, the house where the murders occurred still stands. Today, it operates as a bed and breakfast. Visitors from around the world come to sleep in the rooms where Andrew and Abby Borden drew their last breaths. Some claim to hear footsteps. Others report doors opening on their own. Ghost hunters, historians, and the simply curious come seeking answers. But the truth remains elusive. Over a century later, no one knows for certain who killed Andrew and Abby Borden. Some believe Lizzie acted alone, fueled by resentment and desperation. Others suggest Bridget the maid snapped under pressure. Some whisper about an unknown intruder, a shadowy figure who vanished into the sweltering morning without a trace. But no evidence ever emerged to substantiate these alternatives. The physical space may be preserved, but the truth is not Lizzie. Borden's story is not merely one of crime. It is a story of repression, of psychological isolation, of a woman trapped between social expectation and personal rage. In the late 19th century, women were expected to be obedient, silent, and domestic. Lizzie Borden, in her own horrifying way, shattered that mold. Whether she committed the murders or not, her image as the hatchet-wielding daughter endures. She became a symbol of something deeper, manifestation of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors. Even in the most respectable homes, her case remains one of the most studied and speculated in American legal history. Dozens of books, plays, films, and documentaries have attempted to unpack her motives, her psychology, her guilt or innocence. But perhaps what makes the story truly macabre is that it remains, after all these years, unsolved. We are left with fragments of blood asterisk,